DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, it will continue. The program, founded by former President Barack Obama, provides temporary legal status to more than 700,000 undocumented young people. The temporary status is renewable every 2 years. Last month, though, by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, the court ruled the administration of President Trump did not properly pursue the end of that program, and the president has since vowed to take another crack at it. He's going to revisit that pursuit and try once again to end the program. In the meantime, though, DACA recipients, many of them essential workers, they retain their protection from deportation and maintain their authorization to work. For further clarification about what happens next, we talk to immigration attorney Steve Maggi. Steve, a pleasure to see you again. Thanks for joining us here on Tiempo once more.
Nice to see you as well, Joe. Thank you.
Let me ask you, because upon hearing the news, I'm sure there were many, in fact, we saw it on the news after the decision from the Supreme Court, many of the, roughly 700,000 DACA recipients, immigration advocates, program supporters. I think a lot of them jumped for joy and claimed victory. Is that premature when you look at the decision?
I think it's not premature to celebrate, but the problem is that there are other methods that the president can use to essentially put this back into effect, like an executive order. So it's a temporary victory, and we should definitely, immigrants should be celebrating that, especially the ones that haven't applied for DACA already but could be eligible. Mm-hmm. But it could be a temporary one.
All right. Well, let me focus in more specifically on what the decision was, and tell me if I have it right, because I'm certainly no legal scholar. The Supreme Court ruling, if I saw correctly, reads in part, we do not decide whether DACA or its rescission are sound policies. The wisdom of those decisions is none of our concern. So it sounds like to me that the court neither confirmed nor condemned the efficacy, if you will, of DACA. Do I have it right?
That's correct. Yeah, this is really this decision is based just on the most recent things that happened with DACA, which is essentially that it was rescinded by the Trump administration, or they tried to rescind it. And then the decision was made on whether the decision was made on legal grounds or not, on sufficient legal grounds.
And the 5-4 ruling determined that it was not on legal grounds. I think the terms that they used were the administration's approach was arbitrary and capricious. In what way did they find it to be arbitrary and capricious?
Well, they said that it didn't apply with the Administrative Procedure Act, which was the basis for the executive memorandum that essentially put it into effect. And when it was put into effect, they gave Congress 6 months to come up with essentially a new law that would incorporate DACA or would rescind it or find some sort of middle ground. And Congress obviously couldn't come to a conclusion. They couldn't make law. And so then it went into effect, and immediately there were appeals in the federal courts to ask for injunctions, and injunctions were given. And that's what led to this eventually getting to the Supreme Court.
Now, the president has publicly stated that he will try again. He'll come at it, I guess, from a different angle at this point to try and end the program, despite being only a couple of months away from an election. You can argue whether or not that's a wise approach or not. But in this ruling, from what you've read, and I think the ruling was, 74 pages,
right.
Did the justices give any inclination about how they might vote if the issue, in fact, does come before them again?
No, I think that the opinions were pretty neutral. It was shocking because we had a conservative chief justice that was the deciding vote. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the ruling back in February about the public charge rule, the court went the other direction and voted to uphold the public charge rule, which affects a lot of immigrants. So there's been a major shift just in these past 4 months, which was the most shocking part of this, really, within the court. But there's no indication that this ruling goes any further than just stopping this rescission from happening.
Mm-hmm. So therefore, where do we go from here? I mean, it seems like it's a punt. It goes back to a lower court, or it goes back to Congress in terms of doing your legislative duty to come up with some plan for immigration reform.
Well, I think that's the inherent problem that we've seen in the last 20 years now. Since the DREAM Act was entered into consideration in 2001 under the Bush administration, we haven't had a uniform, comprehensive immigration law passed. And so our system is still broken. And what you have is this strange interplay of what are called executive memorandum and executive orders. So the DACA went into effect in 2012 through an executive memorandum.
President Obama.
Exactly. And then this was rescinded by the Trump administration through another executive memorandum. So that leaves in play here the executive orders, which, as we've seen, President Trump has used a lot recently for immigration-related policies. I think that it's very possible that he could sign an executive order, which essentially would then try to rescind DACA again.
All right, a few more questions for you when we come back from our break. Thanks for staying with us, Steve. We'll be right back. Thanks for hanging with us, Steve. I wanted to ask you about the 700,000, right, roughly DACA recipients now, and through this ruling, they can continue to reapply, correct?
That's correct. They actually were able to maintain their DACA status while the injunction was in place, and this was going up in the court system. But now this assures the fact that they will be able to continue to renew their status. What this doesn't do is give them any status or add any benefit compared to what DACA provided earlier.
Yeah, it's a holding pattern, right? It's the stopgap measure continues.
Correct, but it could hypothetically open the door to those people who were too scared or apprehensive to apply before that are still eligible based on the same requirements.
Well, I was going to get to that. Is it easier to reapply, to renew, or is it easier to apply for the first time? Or is it roughly one and the same?
It's infinitely easier to renew than it is to apply from scratch, yes.
Yes. However, if your calculations are correct, there's roughly 500,000 people who are still eligible to apply as we speak to be doctors.
I think the estimates were between 1.2 and 1.4 million before that were eligible at the time that it came out in 2012. We don't know how many of those individuals might have left the U.S. in that time, but I would imagine it's still about 500,000 people that are eligible.
And as a result of this ruling, did your phone and the phone of your immigration attorney colleagues start ringing from some of those people who said, okay, now I'm interested in making this happen?
I think, the phone has rung a few times. People are still apprehensive. If they're well informed, they know that an executive order might come or something might stop this from actually going back into effect for the rest of the year. There's also the political part, which is maybe we should wait until January to see how the election shakes out in order to apply, because then they know if things change, perhaps that this will go through without any issues.
Yeah, I'm guessing the apprehension that they had before, would it not be the same apprehension they have now regarding the resident at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
I think it's interesting that when Obama was president, that a lot of people still didn't apply. And so I think that the people who are scared now, who were scared then, will be infinitely more scared now, seeing how our current administration is doing so many things to keep immigrants from coming in or from being able to adjust their status or become legal.
What was the fear 6-7 years ago when this first started? Why didn't they apply when you had such a unique opportunity to do so?
I think it's that inherent fear that you sense in the immigrant community, that if once you're in the system, that somehow you'll end up having to leave the U.S. It's just an inherent distrust of the system and the fear that's inherent in that community.
Yeah, they don't want to put their name on a piece of paper somewhere in the files of government where they can easily be found or tracked.
Absolutely. That fear still exists, and I think it's much more palpable now than it was under Obama.
I don't want to get too political, but we do have an election that's just a couple of months away. Are you of the opinion that this election could and will have dramatic impacts on immigration and the potential for comprehensive immigration reform moving forward?
I do. I think, without exaggerating, I would say this is a monumental election in terms of how it affects the immigrant community. And I think the final result will have the biggest impact on immigrants that it's had in half a century, perhaps.
I think that, go ahead.
People know that the person who is in the executive seat there, who has the executive power, has so much power, especially because of these executive memorandum and these executive orders. They have so much power to essentially executive legislation without the need for Congress. So people understand the power that the president has. And so they understand that the person who occupies that seat can really shape and determine where our country goes in terms of immigration, even without congressional intervention. And of course, I would say, to add to that, the outcome of the congressional elections also has a huge impact, especially in the Senate.
And because of that, and perhaps also because we're in the midst of a pandemic, I'm guessing you're not expecting to see immigration come to the floor or even be discussed, certainly within the remainder of this year.
Yeah, unfortunately, I would agree with you. I don't think that word will be mentioned in Congress until 2021.
And
but I'm very hopeful that as soon as there is a change, or if there isn't a change, once the new term starts, that will be first and foremost in the minds of Congress people.
I'm sure it'll be something we'll be talking about soon down the road, maybe in the next few months, but hopefully soon, because a lot of people's lives depend on what happens with immigration reform. Steve Maggi, a pleasure as always. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe. It was great to be with you.
Coming up next on Tiempo, you are going to love this segment and this individual, a 16-year-old Latino from the Bronx. He's teaching kids